Thanks, Kamal, and I would also like to thank Ella and Murthy for giving me this opportunity to come here for this important roundtable meeting. And already, I'm sure the appetite is whetted with all the really invigorating discussions which happened before tea. What I would do is to dwell a little bit deeper into capacity building in terms of course, focusing on infrastructure sector, in terms of going a bit beyond what we have focused on, which is the skill of the engineer and planner in executing the specifications, let us say, but the capacity development or capacity building to reach that stage of being able to do that properly, because that is one of the gap areas why the performance is found to be wanting. And if we quickly look at the transport sector of interest to us, so that includes the roads and bridges, includes the railway systems, both the suburban as well as the intercity, the inland water transport system, the coastal water transport systems, and the infrastructure has to be developed under a tremendous variation in the conditions in terms of in the Himalayas, in the desert, in the coastal region, and also having a lot of other kind of variations. So, when we are looking at capacity development of the professionals and the workmen involved in this entire activity, it has to be keeping in mind all these variations, and it is not necessarily that the same people have to do everything, but we need to understand that the appropriate people need to have the right capacity to be able to deliver the infrastructure which is needed for us. So, capacity development is in a way broader than development of the standards alone. That is an important prerequisite, but not sufficient to be able to deliver the high quality transportation. And this is particularly relevant in future because of the emerging risks which are not adequately addressed in standards. So, there have to be standards, and then there have to be an expectation of performance which goes beyond the minimum or baseline standards, and they have to be a part of the process of capacity development and not necessarily a part of the standard development alone. So, what are the things which are required? First is the conceptualization of infrastructure projects. The fact that you need an infrastructure project of a particular scale or of a particular type, and this requires of course inputs or consideration from technical, financial, social and so on. And of course, once a decision is taken that yes, we want to move forward, then there has to be a planning, and after the planning, the development or the implementation of the infrastructure. And during the implementation, there has to be maintenance, monitoring and maintenance of quality, and after it has been implemented, then of course, there has to be maintenance upgradation. So, infrastructure life cycle broadly requires all of these, and we need to have the capacity to be able to execute it. Now, the key point I want to come to is the very first bullet, which is conceptualization. We somehow implicitly, as technical people, we implicitly assume that there is going to be some body of people not involving technical people who will decide that an infrastructure is needed, and that is when the technical people step in. And the harsh reality is that we build in risks which cannot be done away with at this stage, and then there is very little which the technical people can do. So, conceptualization of project needs to have the right kind of inputs from the technical people, and obviously there has to be a capacity in the technical domain to be able to deliver those inputs in the language and with the depth of information which is required to take that decision. So, capacity requirement, if you think of a triangle in terms of the number of people or say the man years of capacity required, implementation requires the largest, planning and monitoring requires less than that, and the leadership or the conceptualization requires the least. But technical professionals need to have all three, at least different people, not necessarily the same group of people, different people would need to have all three of them. And it is not that we need standards and the ability to implement standards only for planning, monitoring and implementation. We also need to do that for conceptualization. So, what is the current status? is that conceptualization and planning of major infrastructure in India is mainly politically driven decision. It does not mean it is wrong, because the people's representatives are very well grounded with the realities of the nation. So, they have a gut feeling of what is a higher priority and what is not a higher priority, which is far more fine tuned than what we are used to even technically. So, just by being politically driven does not in any way imply incorrect, but it does mean that the benefit of the technical input, benefit of the financial sector input, which could have gone into that process, gets deprived of those kinds of input, sometimes to the peril of all, and more often in terms of resulting in misallocation of resources by overcapacity or undercapacity and so on. So, technical, financial, social, environmental factors end up being a supporting player, that a decision is already taken and now they plug in to see how those decisions can be implemented, instead of it being a holistic thing that all of these are part of the conceptualization and planning itself. And so, what happens, the last point is the conceptualization and planning of infrastructure can be further improved through capacity development among the technical and financial leadership, and that should be a part of the overall goal, because resiliency is built in at this stage. So, if this is not taken care of through codes and standards, and whether prescriptive or performance based, there is very limited scope of bringing resiliency. A good example was given in a meeting I was in yesterday. The Minister of Road Transport and Highways, he informed that there have been discussions on how to improve the road connectivity between Mumbai and Delhi in terms of increasing the capacity of that road. And one of these sectors under discussion, or one of the sections under discussion, was Mumbai to Jaipur. A final decision has been taken to come up with a totally new alignment, not intersecting or overlapping with the current Mumbai-Jaipur highway at any point in that new alignment. And that new alignment would go through some of the most underdeveloped areas of Rajasthan. The distance is shortened. The areas which were away from major economic corridors now are going to have a major economic corridor going through them. So, the kind of spin-off benefit with those entire area would be tremendous. And as he mentioned more and more about it, it was quite obvious that the entire decision has been a political decision, in the sense of not having a feasibility study either from a technical or a financial side available before the decision was taken. So, the feasibility study would now be more in terms of a binary study of yes and no, instead of a collaborative study of what size, what capacity, what duration and so on, which would have been a better way of taking that decision. And by doing the current way, there is a possibility that we would not be able to optimize it as well as we could have if all these decisions were available beforehand. So, we feel that the capacity development has to be a parallel track at many different levels, and not just at the levels which are required after critical decisions are already in place. And as I mentioned earlier, global experience shows that resiliency is factored in at this stage more than at any other stage. So, as we aim for higher resilience in our systems, this would be perhaps the only option which we have. Then also, if we quickly look at the project implementation stages, then the number of stages are there for preparation of DPR, development of the financial model. So, what model are you going to develop it? Is it EPC, is it BOT, is it which kind of model you want? Preparation of the detailed design, then the implementation of the design, or the execution of the project. Then quality assurance and quality control during the project, and maintenance upgradation during the project life cycle. And the current status is that the standards are available only for some of these stages, and they mainly pertain to engineering works, a little bit related to planning, like what was mentioned in terms of say the curves and sighting distances and so on, but mainly related to the engineering aspects. And it is not expected, and neither is it feasible to have standards for all of the stages. So, which again comes down to the fact that in a project, standards are going to have a limited role because they can only address certain issues, and you need to have professional capacity for the other things. So, capacity development even at the lower part of the triangle would be more holistic than just how to implement standards. So, yes, we agree that standards have shortfalls, we agree that standards need to be updated and modified with time, but the best of the standards available would not be enough for good project, not necessarily because the standards are not implemented properly, but because the standards cover only certain aspects of what are required for a good project. So, the capacity development has to have these other things which are outside of the standards. So, we have a lot of success stories, notwithstanding all the complaints and criticisms which keep on coming up. It is good to have a number of standards bodies. Bureau of Indian Standards, of course, is the apex body, it's a statutory body. When it comes to the surface transport, we also have Indian Roads Congress, we have the RDSO from Ministry of Railways, we have the Automotive Research Association of India, which gives us the vehicle loads to be considered for our highways. So, there are a number of standards bodies which are in place. They all do jobs to the best of their ability and to the best of their capacity. We have to see how we strengthen them in their various activities, but again keeping in mind that they would not be able to cover everything which is needed for good quality infrastructure. So, what are the challenges which we feel in terms of resilient infrastructure? My view is that we need to address whose capacity development are we talking about. So, who is the recipient at the end of the capacity development chain, and on what aspects do each one of them need to develop their capacities, and to what extent do we absorb global domain knowledge, and what are the things where it is essential to have fine tuning or consideration of local knowledge. And we need to look into the standard development and updation capacity in the country, that if we want to have, say, more frequent updation of the standards, more training and say capacity building on implementation of standards, what is the ecosystem required to do that? So, that has to be matching with our wish to have updated standards all the time, because otherwise there would be a mismatch resulting in improper end result. And capacity to implement the standards are not just limited to the professionals like the degree holders. It also has to go down to the skilled workman as well as to the semi-skilled or the unskilled workman, because ultimately the quality of delivery would depend on the capacity of all of them. So of course, the strategy required for each of them is different, but the fact remains that all of them have to be somewhere. Maybe some things are higher priority to be taken up first, some things to be taken up later, but we cannot say that only certain strategies should be taken up for resilient infrastructure, because that would not be enough. So if I can show in a picture, then we have three half triangles. The areas represent basically the amount of effort required. So project planning requires, or the capacity building for project planning, including conceptualization, requires a minimum effort. Then the capacity building for standards development require a much larger amount of effort. The engineers over here know that the area of the circle varies as the square of the diameter. And the standards implementation, of course, will require the maximum. And how do we go about it? Who are the people who are involved in standards development? Because there are a few queries in the quantity of professionals in terms of borrowing and so on. So let me put my view in it. I have put three players or three groups of players who are involved in standards development anywhere in the world, and from left to right, as the arrow moves, is the decreasing amount of inputs or involvement. Specialists which are from the research domain, which have, let us say, 10x, 20x more knowledge about all the pros and cons and the short term and the long term implications, what are the thresholds of new development in the horizon. They have to provide the maximum contribution to the development of the standards. Then the specialists amongst the professionals, so people like PG Venkatram and Dr. Mahesh Tandon, as the outstanding bridge engineers. So those specialists would have a little bit less, because they need to say ground truth the translation of research knowledge into practice by seeing what is doable, how it is doable, in what kind of time frame, and so on. And then in terms of the involvement, the least would be the practitioners to do a validation of what is coming, and also to guide the committee on what is doable with what kind of additional effort. So what should be the transition plan for implementation of new standards should be in the thought process of the people who are involved in the development of the standards. So we cannot wish away with the fact that standards development and upgradation or updation should be very strongly grounded on fundamental knowledge of the subject. So researchers have to play the central role in doing it, and the experience worldwide shows that that is broadly the practice which is followed, at least in the engineering domain. Now, in terms of the implementation, the arrow reverses in terms of the amount of effort or involvement required, but again all the three players have to be there. We again cannot wish away by putting glass walls to say that some of those role players would not be required, because this is a feedback loop. It's a feedback mechanism which goes into the constant development of a good quality implementable standard. So the reverse direction is also, in my view, equally important. So what I did, this is my last slide. I just sort of try to recap the most important issues on the basis of the background document in terms of the key questions, and I want to consciously move or put the add financial everywhere, because we are in this institution, that how can technical and financial factors be mainstreamed in project conceptualization and planning. We need to do it through capacity development of the professionals in this field, to be able to talk to and engage with the policymakers in the language which they are familiar with, instead of forcing them to deal with us in our language. Then who should be involved in the standards development and the implementation for transportation sector? I given you my view that it's all the three players and with the kind of level of involvement, but these are open issues for discussion. And then lastly, what professional development strategies are required to improve the implementation ecosystem, knowing very well that the implementation ecosystem has to go beyond the technical professionals. It has to go to skilled workmen, and even more importantly, go to the unskilled and the semi-skilled workmen. So that's all I would like to say. Thank you.